Monday morning in western Colombia. Cali is filling with traffic. Pereira is opening for the week. Then, shortly after 7:30, more than 100 kilometers beneath Chocó, the ground gives way. A magnitude 7.4 earthquake sends shaking across a region home to millions. Walls crack in Pereira. Buildings fail in Cali. Emergency lines fill faster than they can be answered. Nobody yet knows how large this will become. The shaking lasts under a minute. Understanding what it has done will take days. Colombia sits on one of the most complicated stretches of the Pacific Ring of Fire. Along its western edge, the Nazca Plate is sliding beneath the South American continent, a process that has continued for millions of years and never truly stops. Stress builds along the boundary until rock gives way, releasing energy as seismic waves. This earthquake did not originate at the surface. It originated deep an intermediate depth event, roughly 100 to 107 kilometers beneath the mountains near San Jose del Palmar, in the department of Chocó. Depth usually works in a region's favor. The deeper the rupture, the farther seismic waves must travel before reaching buildings, and the more energy dissipates along the way. But magnitude 7.4 releases an extraordinary amount of energy. Even weakened by distance, seismic waves from a quake this size can still travel outward strongly enough to shake cities more than 100 kilometers away. Depth reduced the danger, it did not remove it. According to the Colombian Geological Service, this was the strongest earthquake recorded in Colombia during the 21st century. What made it dangerous wasn't just the number 7.4, it was how far that shaking traveled and what it found waiting on the surface. Older buildings, soft ground in some neighborhoods, and cities built long before anyone could calculate exactly how the earth beneath them might move. A deep earthquake is not a safe earthquake. It is an earthquake that spreads its risk farther than people expect. By the time the shaking reached Cali and Pereira, it was no longer a geological event. It was becoming a human one. Near San Jose del Palmar, the earthquake's effects were immediate and isolating. Power lines fell. Communication towers went down. Roads through the mountains cracked and slid, cutting off communities that were already difficult to reach on a normal day. In Cali, Colombia's third largest city, home to more than 2 million people, the shaking arrived strong enough to bring down what decades of wear had already weakened. Some apartment buildings collapsed completely. Others lost only a stairwell, a facade, a single floor. Firefighters and residents began pulling at concrete and rebar within minutes before official rescue teams could even arrive. 90 kilometers northeast, in Pereira, the coffee region's largest city, the pattern repeated. Homes came down. Schools and health facilities were damaged. Streets filled with people unwilling to go back inside. Farther out, the earthquake's reach showed up in smaller signs. Cracked walls in Buenaventura, inspections closing several regional airports, structural teams moving street by street through towns across the coffee-growing interior. Not every building fell. That is what made the damage so difficult to predict. A modern structure could stand untouched beside an older one, reduced to rubble proof that construction quality, local soil, and sheer chance decided as much as the earthquake itself. By mid-morning, the shaking had stopped. For the people trapped beneath what didn't hold, nothing about their situation had gotten easier. In Cali, the first hours belonged to whoever was already nearby. Neighbors climbed onto debris before trucks with equipment could get through traffic clogged with people trying to reach relatives. Firefighters arrived to find civilians already working and absorbed them into organized search lines. Search dogs went in first, followed by crews with listening equipment built to detect movement, breathing, even a knock against concrete. Diesel generators and cutting tools ran through the day. Every so often, a commander called for silence, and for a few seconds an entire street stopped moving so a dog or a microphone could work. Reuters reported rescuers pulling both adults and children alive from collapsed buildings in Cali in the earthquake's early hours, proof that speed and coordination were saving lives even as the death toll climbed elsewhere. In Pereira, similar scenes played out at a smaller scale. Crews working through damaged apartment blocks, ambulances shuttling the injured to hospitals already stretched by the morning's first wave of patients. Time works against trapped survivors, but not on a fixed clock. The The chances of finding someone alive generally fall as hours pass, yet people have been pulled from rubble days after being buried. That uncertainty is what kept crews working through exhaustion, refusing to declare a site finished. Aftershocks complicated everything. A tremor strong enough to be felt could send a crew backing out of a structure they had spent hours stabilizing, forcing them to start the calculation over. By nightfall, thousands of people in Cali and Pereira had nowhere they trusted to sleep. They gathered outside on sidewalks, in parks, in the parking lots of buildings they no longer believed would hold. By the second and third day, the earthquake had produced two overlapping crises. One was still about finding people, the other was about housing thousands who no longer had anywhere safe to go. More than 200 aftershocks followed the main earthquake, and each one mattered. A building cracked, but standing after the first shock could fail after the 15th. Engineers moved from block to block, marking structures green, yellow, or red, but a red tag couldn't stop the fear driving people out of homes that hadn't been marked at all. Shelters filled in Cali and Pereira with families who had lost their homes or simply refused to re-enter them. Aid organizations distributed water, food, and medicine, while hospitals, some damaged themselves, treated a rising number of injured alongside their usual patients. In Chocó, near where the earthquake began, the response looked different. Roads into some communities remained cut. Communication stayed limited in places already hard to reach before the ground moved. Reaching a damaged village here could take as long as digging through a collapsed building in Cali. The emergency simply wore a different shape. Regional airports, closed immediately after the earthquake for structural inspection, began reopening one by one as engineers cleared runways and terminals. By the end of the week, all but one had resumed operations, a small, practical sign that some parts of the system were recovering even as others weren't. Search efforts in the hardest-hit buildings began to change character. Some sites were still being worked as rescues. Others, quietly and without announcement, had already become something else. As of the evening of August 15, official estimates reported by Reuters placed the death toll at around 290. About 140 people were still listed as missing, and nearly 4,000 had been injured. By then, more than 269 aftershocks had followed the main earthquake. But 5 days after the ground moved, numbers were no longer the only measure of what had happened. In Cali and Pereira, rescue operations had narrowed to fewer sites. At some collapsed buildings, crews were still searching for signs of life. At others, the work had shifted toward recovering those who had not survived. Thousands of displaced residents remained in shelters or temporary accommodation, while engineers continued deciding which damaged buildings could safely be occupied again. Essential services were returning unevenly, roads reopened, most affected airports resumed operations after inspections. Electricity and water came back in some communities, while others, particularly in harder-to-reach parts of Chocó, faced a slower recovery. The emergency was beginning to change shape. The first days had been measured in minutes how quickly rescuers could reach a void, stabilize concrete, or get an injured survivor to a hospital. The next phase would be measured in months and years, housing, schools, hospitals, businesses, and communities that now had to be rebuilt. The World Bank released $200 million in emergency financing and began assessing the wider economic damage, but reconstruction will involve more than replacing what fell. Investigators and engineers will also have to understand why some buildings failed while others beside them remained standing. Earthquakes do not distribute their force according to a map of who can afford to lose a home, and magnitude alone does not decide who survives. This earthquake began more than 100 kilometers beneath Colombia. Its consequences were decided at the surface by buildings, ground conditions, preparation, access, and how quickly help could reach the people who needed it. The shaking lasted less than a minute. For Western Colombia, recovering from it will take far longer.